They laughed when they handed them heavy pipe wrenches, massive iron flanges, and rusted shovels instead of armor-piercing artillery. They laughed when they shipped them to the most blistering, suffocating, sun-scorched deserts of the North African theater, absolutely convinced that their minds were too primitive to understand advanced battlefield strategy and their blood too cowardly to ever hold a desperate line under fire. Imagine being drafted into the grueling 120-degree hell of the Second World War, surviving the brutal, bone-crushing rigors of basic training, only to be officially classified by your own government as a second-class labor pool. In the bitter, relentless summer of 1943, deep within the rocky, unforgiving canyons of Tunisia, this was not a philosophical debate about civil rights. It was the agonizing, daily reality for the men of the 383rd Pipeline Pumping Company. They were a segregated, entirely African-American unit of military pipefitters, roughnecks, and fluid dynamics engineers. In the rigidly prejudiced United States military machine, they were explicitly classified as a disposable logistical asset. They were not issued heavy anti-tank guns or armored half-tracks. They were equipped with massive, 8-inch heavy steel pipes, colossal diesel-powered booster pumps, and miles of thick iron threading. They were the invisible, sweating backbone of the Allied desert invasion, expected to silently carve a path through the lethal, rocky gorges, to build the pressurized water and fuel arteries that kept the army alive, absorbing the absolute worst of the equatorial sun and enemy sniper fire, while the elite white armored divisions rolled forward to claim the glory. Before we march into the blinding heat and the choking dust with these forgotten giants of the desert, I need to know who is holding the canyon with us today. These men built the physical lifelines of liberation in absolute anonymity, and in return, they were systemically erased from the history books. Whether you are watching this from a high-rise in London, a crowded street in Detroit, or a quiet rural town thousands of miles from the sand, drop your city in the comments right now. Let's map out our own global battalion in honor of the men the establishment intentionally left to bake in the desert. The profound tragedy of the 383rd Pipeline Company was born from a catastrophic, deeply arrogant intelligence failure by the Allied High Command. Miles away from the suffocating, blistering horror of the canyon, the American generals had confidently declared the eastern mountain pass entirely secured. They had ordered the segregated pipeliners to rapidly lay a massive, high-pressure, forward water artery directly through a narrow, steep-walled, rocky gorge to supply an upcoming infantry push. The black engineers spent 72 agonizing hours in the blistering heat, wrestling with massive steel pipes and heavy iron joints under the relentless desert sun, successfully completing the colossal infrastructure. But the reality of the African ground war was deeply unforgiving, and the enemy was not broken. Deep within the blinding, swirling sandstorms of the eastern desert, an elite, highly mechanized vanguard of the German Afrika Korps, supported by a terrifying column of massive, impenetrable panzer tanks, had entirely bypassed the main American combat patrols. They were rolling silently through the rocky valleys, preparing to launch a devastating surprise counter-assault directly through the newly piped gorge to shatter the Allied supply lines. Up on the high desert ridge overlooking the canyon, a group of white American commanding officers and logistics captains had just arrived in pristine staff cars to inspect the pipeline. When they looked through their polished brass binoculars and saw the rapidly advancing wave of elite German armor pouring out of the dust, the local command structure entirely and instantly collapsed into a cowardly panic. The officers ordered their drivers to immediately turn the jeeps around, preparing to flee back across the open desert to the safety of the western base camps. As the engines roared to life, the commanding major sent a final, frantically typed radio transmission to the segregated pipeliners who were still standing in the sweltering dust of the gorge floor. The message was sterile, brief, and completely devoid of any human empathy. The company of the 383rd was ordered to remain in the hostile canyon. They were explicitly instructed to drop their heavy wrenches, pick up their light standard-issue rifles, and physically barricade the narrow pass with their own bodies to prevent the German armor from advancing. There was no promise of an armored extraction. There was no timeline for heavy artillery support. The command simply weighed the lives of 150 black pipefitters against the time it would take to secure their own cowardly retreat, and crossed the men out with a red pencil. They were biologically cheap, entirely expendable speed bumps, left behind to be slaughtered in the sand while the officers sped away to the safety of the rear lines. Panic, raw, suffocating, and completely mathematically justified, began to tear through the ranks of the abandoned pipeline company. The narrow, rocky gorge was rapidly transforming into an inescapable, blistering slaughterhouse. The ground was already beginning to rhythmically tremble beneath their heavy boots, vibrating with the distant, terrifying mechanical thunder of the advancing panzer tanks. The men of the 383rd were trapped, with their backs to a steep, impassable cliff face. They had no heavy weapons, no explosives, and their standard-issue rifles were absolutely useless against hardened Krupp steel. It was a mathematical death sentence. The young men, drafted from the segregated neighborhoods of Chicago and the rural oil fields of Texas, fell to their knees in the burning, rocky dirt, hiding behind pathetic stacks of spare steel pipes, praying to a god that seemed utterly absent from this cursed desert canyon. But standing in the absolute center of the pumping station, entirely ignoring the chaotic, terrifying roar of the approaching panzers, was First Sergeant Marcus "Valve" Sterling. He was a colossal, broad-shouldered man in his late 40s, his heavy canvas uniform completely soaked and permanently stained with thick diesel fuel and pipe grease. Before the war, Marcus had not learned physics from an Ivy League textbook or a pristine military engineering academy. He was a master roughneck and a high-pressure fluid dynamicist who had spent years working on the deepest, most dangerous wildcat oil rigs of the American Southwest. He was a man who had spent his entire adult life manipulating the terrifying, uncompromising physical laws of immense hydrostatic pressure, extreme fluid velocity, and raw hydraulic leverage. He did not look at the advancing German armor and see an unbeatable military fortress, and he did not look at the blistering, steep-walled canyon and see an inescapable grave. He looked down at the massive 8-inch heavy steel pipeline they had just laid perfectly down the center of the gorge. He looked at the colossal, multi-ton diesel booster pumps, designed to push millions of gallons of water across miles of desert. The officers who had fled expected these men to die cowering in the dirt, fighting hopelessly with rifles against tank shells. But they had completely forgotten what these men actually did for a living. They were not just soldiers. They were the absolute, undisputed masters of extreme hydrostatic physics. "Listen to me!" Marcus roared, his deep, gravelly voice slicing cleanly through the howling desert wind and the paralyzing terror of his men. His massive hands gripped a heavy, forged iron pipe wrench. The brass ran away because they think we are nothing but ditch diggers. They think we do not know how to fight because they abandon us in the sand. But we do not need their artillery. We are the men who control the pressure, and we know exactly how to make this pipe burst. Marcus pointed his heavy, grease-stained finger directly at the massive iron dead-end cap at the far end of the pipeline. We are going to turn this entire canyon into the biggest, heaviest hydraulic water cannon the world has ever seen. Drop your rifles. Grab every heavy wrench, every iron sealing ring, and fire up those diesel boosters. We are not going to shoot those tanks. We are going to cut them entirely in half with the water. The 150 abandoned pipeliners instantly transformed from a panicked, forgotten labor pool into a frantic, blindingly efficient forge of absolute battlefield survival. The sheer, agonizing terror that had paralyzed them minutes before was entirely burned away, replaced by a cold, calculating, and terrifyingly focused mechanical rage. They were fighting for their fundamental right to exist, wielding the exact heavy industrial equipment the military establishment had used to humiliate them. They did not try to dig shallow trenches to hide from the incoming shells. They waded directly into the sweltering, dust-choked center of the gorge, moving with the synchronized, rhythmic perfection of men who had spent years fighting the massive pressures of the earth. Under Marcus's rapid-fire, highly technical orders, squads of men sprinted to the massive anchoring mechanisms and the diesel pumping station. Working with sheer, desperate adrenaline, the men violently violated every structural safety protocol in the engineering manual. First, they completely sealed the downstream end of the pipeline with a massive iron dead cap, welding it shut to ensure absolutely zero fluid could escape. Then, they moved to the colossal diesel booster pumps. Instead of running them at the standard operational pressure, the men violently bypassed the mechanical safety governors, physically locking the throttles wide open. They were pumping tens of thousands of gallons of incompressible water directly into a dead-ended steel pipe, building the hydrostatic pressure to an astronomical, terrifying degree. Marcus was engineering a catastrophic, highly unstable physical phenomenon known as a catastrophic hydraulic blowout, but scaled up to an apocalyptic, weaponized level. Water is fundamentally incompressible. By forcing a massive length, continuous volume of fluid into a sealed steel chamber, the internal pressure was violently spiking from a safe 500 psi to a catastrophic length, mind-bending 50,000 psi. The entire 8-inch steel pipeline began to physically groan and vibrate, emitting a terrifying, high-pitched metallic shriek as the molecules of water strained against the immense, unnatural confinement. The entire gorge floor was being weaponized into a macroscopic kinetic hair trigger, holding back a physical force that defied human comprehension. Marcus positioned his massive frame directly beside a primary, heavy cast iron release valve situated perfectly in the narrowest choke point of the canyon. In his calloused, grease-stained hands, he held the massive sledgehammer. He looked down the dusty, sun-baked road, the air thick with heat haze and diesel exhaust. He knew the terrifying, uncompromising laws of extreme fluid dynamics and the principles of macroscopic water jet cutting. If he shattered the cast iron valve, while the massive weight of the enemy tanks was concentrated directly over the pipe, the astronomically pressurized water would not simply leak, it would violently, instantaneously, seek physical equilibrium through the narrowest possible fracture. The sudden release of the millions of pounds of hydrostatic pressure would cause the fluid to accelerate to supersonic speeds, creating a hyper-dense, razor-sharp blade of solid water that could cleanly slice through solid granite, heavy industrial steel, and human bone without even slowing down. Marcus was intentionally creating the exact catastrophic engineering nightmare that ripped apart high-pressure dams. He was building a localized apocalypse made of raw hydraulic pressure and cold water. The pipeliners retreated up the rocky canyon walls, clutching their heavy tools, holding their breath as the distant, terrifying mechanical squeal of the German Panzer tanks began to echo through the dust. The elite predators of the Desert War were driving blindly toward the choke point, completely unaware that the abandoned American pipefitters had just rewired the fundamental laws of physics to welcome them. The elite vanguard of the Africa Corps surged into the rocky gorge with the terrifying, mechanized arrogance of men who believed they were invincible. The massive, 30-ton Panzer tanks thundered forward, their heavy, wide steel tracks violently churning the desert dirt, the long, lethal barrels of their main cannons sweeping the abandoned American supply crates. This was the apex predator of the African theater, a moving fortress of hardened, corrupt steel that had ruthlessly annihilated infantry lines across the continent. The German tank commanders, standing securely in their open cupolas, expected to find nothing but a chaotic, disorganized slaughterhouse of terrified American laborers cowering in the sand. The deafening, relentless roar of their own massive engines completely masked the terrifying, high-pitched, agonizing shriek of the highly stressed, hydrostatically overloaded steel pipeline buried just inches beneath their tracks. The German shock troops were entirely blind to the catastrophic, physics-defying industrial trap waiting in the dirt. They drove their massive tanks directly over the primary cast iron valve, completely committing their immense weight to the exact center of the kinetic kill zone. They were rolling directly into the absolute heart of a colossal, highly unstable hydraulic spring, holding back millions of pounds of raw, unadulterated tension. Up on the distant desert ridge, the white American officers who had fled lowered their binoculars, anticipating the brutal, inevitable slaughter of their own men and the successful breakthrough of the enemy. Standing in the blistering, suffocating heat at the edge of the rocky trench, his massive chest heaving with adrenaline, First Sergeant Marcus Sterling did not blink. His calloused, grease-stained hands tightened around the heavy hickory handle of the sledgehammer. He watched the massive, heavily armored lead Panzer tank reach the exact center of the choke point, perfectly positioned over the humming, violently vibrating steel valve. He could see the absolute confidence in the enemy machine, completely unaware that a segregated blue-collar roughneck from Texas was about to violently rewrite the laws of armored combat, using nothing but water physics. The heavily strained steel pipe vibrating at Marcus's feet was screaming in mechanical agony, physically throwing off chips of rust as the hydrostatic pressure threatened to tear it apart from the inside. Marcus knew that if he waited even 5 seconds longer, the pipe would spontaneously rupture in the wrong place, completely ruining the fluid geometry and destroying the trap. He took a deep, burning breath of the dust-soaked air, raised the heavy iron sledgehammer high above his head, and swung it down in a devastating, blinding arc. He did not hit the enemy tanks. He struck the heavy, forged iron collar of the primary release valve, holding back the violently pressurized water. The deafening, sharp crack of the solid iron shattering under the extreme kinetic blow was instantly swallowed by a sound so entirely terrifying, so fundamentally unnatural, that it would haunt the nightmares of every man in that canyon for the rest of their lives. When millions of pounds of mechanically stored hydrostatic energy are violently, instantaneously released through a microfracture, the resulting physical reaction defies the human senses. The massive steel pipeline did not simply burst. It violently, instantaneously transitioned into a macroscopic, hyperdense, supersonic liquid blade. The sheer hydraulic force of the incompressible water, violently seeking equilibrium, slammed outward. Within a microscopic fraction of a second, the entire canyon floor transitioned from solid dirt into a catastrophic wave of absolute kinetic annihilation. The hyper-pressurized water violently snapped upward with a concussive, deafening acoustic boom that physically knocked the hidden American engineers off their feet. The macroscopic water jet hit the incredibly heavy, slow-moving German armor from directly underneath with the crushing, inescapable kinetic force of a localized volcanic eruption. The massive, 30-ton steel fortresses did not just flip. Their heavy, armored underbellies were cleanly and instantaneously sliced open by the supersonic liquid blade. The catastrophic, razor-sharp water pressure violently sheared through the engine blocks, detonating the fuel reserves and catapulting the impenetrable Panzer tanks entirely off the ground. The catastrophic hydraulic whip hurled the shattered, burning remains of the heavy armor against the steep canyon walls like discarded toys, completely swallowing the elite Africa Corps crews in a blinding, horrifying matrix of churning mud, crushing hydraulic pressure, and exploding steel. The immediate aftermath was not a battle. It was a completely sterilized, absolute, physical erasure. The apex predators of the Desert War, the elite, heavily armored vanguard that had terrified the entire Allied command structure into a cowardly, disorganized sacrifice, had been instantaneously wiped from the face of the earth. They had not been defeated by superior armored tactics or heavy aerial bombardment. They had been entirely obliterated by the terrifying, invisible laws of extreme hydrostatic physics and fluid dynamics, weaponized by men who had been handed pipe wrenches instead of artillery support. The absolute silence that slowly descended upon the ruined gorge was broken only by the steady, relentless roar of the geyser of water flooding over the submerged, twisted wreckage of the trap, and the heavy, settling dust falling on the sterilized mud. The 150 African-American pipeline engineers of the 383rd slowly, shakily, pushed themselves up from the rocky canyon walls. They were entirely exhausted, their uniforms completely soaked in water, diesel, and mud, their ears ringing with a high-pitched, agonizing whine from the supersonic shockwave of the ruptured pipe. They staggered to the edge of the churning, muddy crater, gripping their heavy tools, and looked down at the absolute, unimaginable devastation they had just created. The invincible Panzer tanks were completely gone, entirely erased beneath a towering, chaotic graveyard of rushing water and shredded steel. Marcus leaned heavily against a remaining rock outcropping, wiping a thick layer of wet dirt from his exhausted face. He looked at the young engineers from Chicago and Texas, men who had been explicitly told their entire lives that they were cowards, inherently inferior, and unfit for the rigors of combat. He watched as they stood tall in the sweltering heat, realizing that they were not pack mules, and they were not disposable. They had held the absolute center of the line. They were the undisputed, absolute masters of the pressure. They had survived an unwinnable war by rewriting the very physics of the Earth. For 3 agonizing hours, the company of the 383rd held the ruined canyon entirely alone, waiting in the blistering, oppressive heat for an enemy counterattack that never came. And then, slowly cutting across the desert floor from the western ridge, came the heavily armed half-tracks and pristine staff officers of the American command structure. The generals had not come back to launch a desperate rescue mission. They had explicitly sacrificed the pipeliners hours before, fully expecting them to be slaughtered and the gorge to be overrun. They were only coming back now because the deafening mechanical noise had ceased, and they wanted to assess the loss of their tactical water supply. As the spotless, heavily armed command vehicles pulled up to the muddy, flooded canyon floor, the white military officers standing on the decks were completely paralyzed by absolute, slack-jawed incomprehension. The commanding major, a pristine, aristocratic man who had cowardly fled across the desert in his jeep, stepped onto the wet mud. His polished leather boots gleamed in the harsh weather, completely untouched by the mud and the blood of the infantry. He lowered his binoculars, his face pale with utter confusion. He looked at the massive, completely destroyed German armored column, swallowed in the rushing, muddy water of the shattered pipeline. And then his gaze shifted to the edge of the crater, where 150 black engineers stood defiantly among the heat haze, holding their heavy wrenches and sledgehammers. First Sergeant Marcus Sterling stepped forward, his massive frame towering over the cowardly major. He offered a slow, heavy, utterly exhausted salute. "The canyon is secure, sir," Marcus's deep, gravelly voice echoed across the silent desert. "The enemy armor has been completely neutralized. We held the line." The commanding major did not return the salute. He gripped his pristine uniform coat, his eyes darting frantically from the catastrophic destruction of the shredded tanks to the exhausted engineers. In his rigidly segregated, deeply prejudiced worldview, the reality standing right in front of him was mathematically and fundamentally impossible. "You neutralized them, Sergeant?" the major asked, his voice dripping with cold, aristocratic disgust and heavy, undisguised condescension. "You expect me to believe that a segregated labor company stopped an elite Panzer vanguard without anti-tank guns?" "We used the pressure, sir," Marcus replied, his jaw set like carved granite, completely refusing to back down. "We dead-ended the downstream pipe and bypassed the diesel governors. When their armor hit the center valve, we shattered the cast iron. The hydrostatic blowout and the supersonic water jet cut them entirely in half." The major stared at the massive roughneck for 5 agonizing seconds, and then he let out a sharp, cruel, entirely dismissive laugh. It was a laugh born of sheer, terrifying insecurity. "Let me tell you what actually happened here, Sergeant," the major sneered, shaking his head and pointing a pristine, gloved finger at Marcus. "This German armor obviously suffered a catastrophic structural collapse due to an undetected Allied minefield, and their munitions simply sympathetically detonated. And you and your panicked labor crew came crawling out of the rocks after the fact to claim the glory." Marcus froze. The accusation was so profoundly vile, so entirely detached from the horrific, brilliant reality they had just survived, that for a moment, the massive sergeant could not even speak. "My men stood in this blistering heat to build that pipe when you sat in your tent, and we broke it to kill them when you ran away, sir," Marcus growled, his voice dropping to a dangerous, heavy rumble of pure, working-class fury. "We built that pressure. We broke those tanks." The major's face flushed a violent defensive red. The terrifying idea that a company of black laborers had outsmarted, outfought, and completely outperformed the white officers who had cold-bloodedly sacrificed them was a narrative his fragile establishment pride simply could not accept. Acknowledging their heroism would force him to explicitly acknowledge his own profound, sociopathic cowardice. "The only thing I see here, Sergeant, is a massive, unauthorized destruction of a multi-million-dollar United States military tactical pipeline," the major snapped, pointing at the completely submerged, ruined infrastructure. "You intentionally sabotaged our strategic logistics water supply because you panicked and blew the valves instead of fighting." The major turned to the heavily armed military police stepping off the half-tracks. "Disarm these men of their tools. Arrest First Sergeant Sterling immediately. I am charging him with gross negligence. dereliction of duty, and the willful, malicious destruction of critical wartime property. The heavily armed MPs leveled their submachine guns, aiming them directly at the exhausted, sweat-soaked men who had just saved the entire Allied flank. The betrayal was absolute. It was a crushing, suffocating weight that hurt infinitely more than the blistering heat or the terror of the German assault. They had faced the ultimate enemy, commanded the terrifying laws of extreme hydrostatic physics, and won an entirely unwinnable war. And their only reward was to be stared down by the guns of their own commanders. Their impossible, physics-defying heroism was instantly erased, stolen, and buried by the very cowardly establishment that had intentionally sacrificed them to die in the sand. This is the exact reason you will never find the name Marcus Sterling or the heroes of the 383rd Pipeline Pumping Company in your high school history textbooks. The United States military brass entirely, aggressively sanitized the official after-action reports. The destruction of the elite German Panzer tanks was officially falsely credited to spontaneous munitions failure and targeted Allied aerial bombardment. The 150 brave, brilliant men of the Pipeline Company were quietly split up, threatened with general court-martials if they ever spoke of the true events, and shipped to other forgotten, blistering deserts to continue building in the dark. Their unimaginable brilliance, their sheer industrial genius, was completely buried beneath mountains of redacted, classified paperwork and systemic arrogance. But the absolute truth is permanently written into the shattered bedrock of that African canyon. The truth lives in the calloused, grease-stained hands of the working-class men who actually bleed in the deepest, most dangerous corners of the earth, doing the heavy lifting, while the cowards at the very top steal all the glory and aggressively hide the evidence. This history is your inheritance. The establishment tried to sanitize the truth, just like they tried to sanitize the battlefields. They expected these men to die quietly in the dust, but they used the very tools of their oppression to completely shatter the enemy. Now it is your turn to fight the second phase of this war, the war of memory. The algorithm of this platform is exactly like the prejudice history books of the 20th century. It favors the comfortable, easy lie over the difficult, bleeding truth. It wants to bury this history. Do not let them. If this story made you feel a profound sense of awe, anger, or pride, you have a duty. You are now a soldier in the regiment of memory. Share this video. Send it to anyone who thinks history is only made by generals with silver stars on their shoulders. Post it on your timeline and force the world to look at the faces of the men who were intentionally sacrificed by their country and still found a way to win. And before you scroll away to the next distraction, go to the comments right now. For the men who fought the blistering heat, the crushing pressure, and the cold-blooded betrayal of their own commanders, leave a final roll call across time. Type the words, "We hold the pressure." Let's build a massive wall of text in the comments that no bureaucratic cover-up, no cowardly general, and no algorithm can ever erase.